Chinese state-sponsored threat actors were likely behind the hijacking of Notepad++ update traffic last year that lasted for almost half a year, the developer states in an official announcement today. A statement from the hosting provider for the update feature explains that the logs indicate that the hacker compromised the server with Notepad++ update application. External security experts helping with the investigation found that the attack started in June of 2025. So I guess for anyone who doesn't use Windows, Notepad++ is basically a advanced version of Notepad that has a lot of the features that you would expect in, advanced note-taking applications like syntax highlighting and such. So it definitely builds upon the Notepad piece of software that's available in Windows. It's basically like a fully featured alternative to that. And it's actually extremely popular. So that's why it's extremely concerning that the update feature has been hijacked by Chinese state hackers. I'm just quoting from the article again here. The attackers specifically targeted Notepad++ domains with the goal of exploiting insufficient update verification controls that existed in older versions of Notepad++. So basically in December, Notepad++ released version 8.8.9, which addressed a security weakness in its WinGUP update tool. After multiple researchers reported the updater would receive malicious packages instead of legitimate ones. There was a great post on Mastodon that I saw by security researcher Kevin Beaumont, where he warned that at least 3 organizations were affected by these update hijacks, which were followed by hands-on reconnaissance activity on the network. This is kind of a pretty concerning story, especially because it's such a popular piece of software. Like, a lot of people on Windows that are editing text files will be using this software.
One thing to note in the article is it does mention that this attack was very targeted, in that the attackers very likely only targeted specific users of Notepad++. And actually, real quick on that note, I think here at the bottom of this article, there's some links. They talk about this group called Rapid7 that did research on this, and they released an analysis, a technical analysis of the malware, and they do include how to check and see if you were compromised. I believe they included hashes of specific files, basically, that you can check and see if you have the right file or a compromised file, if you are worried that you may be impacted by this. First of all, go ahead and update to the latest one, because hopefully that should fix it and close off access. But also, you can double check that to see. And it's really unfortunate because Notepad++ kind of checks all the boxes that we would normally advertise for a good privacy tool, right? I mean, it's open source. As far as I know, it's offline. I'm sure it pings for like updates and stuff, but it's not a cloud-based Notepad. It's very actively maintained. The developer is very active, but this happened. I was sitting here when I was reading this story and I was, taking notes for the show. I was thinking to myself, I'm like, what's the lesson here? Because normally the lesson is like, try to stick to open source, or, try to make sure you only get it from official sources. But when there's a supply chain attack like this, there's kind of just not much you can do, I guess. So I don't know. Is there any better lesson that you took away from this one? Or?
Yeah, I think this is kind of an unfortunate circumstance, right? But I think it does need to be said that, open source tools are just as vulnerable to being exploited by these sort of things as closed source ones. Just because a tool is open source doesn't technically mean that this wouldn't have happened, or this would have happened, right? But I think when it comes to, note-taking tools and such, I think it's important to use tools that have been independently verified, right? So if a security researcher had done an audit on this piece of software, for example, I think it would have been pretty obvious that this was a mistake in the update process, right? Any security researcher that would have had an eye over this would have noticed this. I think there's things you can do to make sure that the software you're using doesn't contain easily exploitable stuff like this. So, with privacy guides, a lot of times we require independent verification by security researchers, or like a security firm such as like Cure53 or other ones. That is something you can do to try and mitigate some of these concerns. But in that case as well, it is, things get missed. Not every single piece of software is infallible. Someone in the chat said, JS said a secure OS could help a lot. Yeah, exactly. So if you have an operating system that has more control over the sandboxing of applications, there's all sorts of things you can do on Mac OS, and Windows even has some sandboxing capabilities. So I think that is another important thing that people need to think about, right? Having adequate security protections and sandboxing and separating tasks into separate areas can definitely reduce the damage of an attack, because in all circumstances it's possible. Like, every piece of software can be exploited. So trying to reduce the damage that can happen is definitely a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned audits because that did completely slip my mind because audits are really good. And it's, I do want to point out that audits, and you did kind of mention this, like things can still slip through the cracks because audits are a snapshot of code at a specific point in time. So it's entirely possible that Notepad could have been audited in June or let's say May, and then this happened like the following month. And there's really nothing to protect against that. But another advantage of audits is that they tend to show that an organization is really serious about their security and securing their supply chain and stuff like that. Again, I want to point out like audits are also really expensive. So just because a company doesn't get an audit doesn't mean that they're not safe or they're not taking it seriously, especially if it's like a really hobbyist project. Like I think Notepad++, if I remember correctly, is donation only. So they probably don't have thousands of dollars to invite Cure 53 to come in and look at their code. But for those organizations that do have that kind of money, like Proton, Molvad, Signal, when they bring in auditors and have them look at their code and they have that kind of resource, it shows that, again, like you said, things can slip through the cracks, but it's a really good sign because it means that they're probably have like a culture of security and it's less likely for bad things to happen.